Alright, hello and welcome everyone to a new Atlas builds refresh. Obviously, with all of the Exalted changes, Atlas has changed fairly significantly, so we've got to talk about it. For that, of course, the actual abilities on Atlas have not been reworked in any way, so don't expect to really get any use out of Rumblers outside of the Augment, which we're going to talk about, or his 2, which we have replaced here with Nourish. However, Atlas's Petrify and Landslide are still very good abilities, and you're going to be spamming them quite a bit. In terms of shards, before we get into the actual build, I'm just on a parkour velocity and 1 casting speed. Casting speed's really nice both for Subsumes and for Atlas's 3. On the 1, it does not make a tremendous difference, but in the parkour velocity is just nice for getting around. These are just to taste. You do not need either of them, so if you don't have any shards, it is not a big deal. It is, however, worth noting that this build is prepped for the addition of purple shards if you want to significantly increase your critical hit damage. So, if you want to fill these 3 slots with Tau purple shards and add, over 200% critical damage to this build, you're welcome to do so. It will make the build stronger or weaker in some cases, which we'll get into. With that, the build looks like this. This is a full Umbral build, and right away we're going to talk about making this cheaper. Number 1, with the build that we're going to show on our Landslide, you do not need Archon Stretch. Unless you're doing the Influence version of your Landslide, Archon Stretch is only going to be proccing from your companions and stuff. So unless you are doing that, this isn't really adding anything. The 2 energy a second is really, really nice, basically meaning you're kind of combining your usual stretch with Nexus. Gives you some good efficiency, especially because it will keep your upkeep on your 1 really easily. Other than that, we are on full Umbrals, and it is instantly much cheaper and not that much of a performance difference to use an unranked Umbral Fiber. That means you can drop this Umbral polarity and this polarity, taking this down to just a 2 forma build, which I think is perfectly accessible. Of course, I have it formatted all the way up here just to show off the full end build. We are on full Umbrals plus Blessing plus Adaptation, which is a ton of defenses. We have 3,000 health, a ton of armor, especially whenever you're considering the additional armor that we're going to be getting from building up our Rumble from our passive. Well, our passive in addition to not being able to be knocked down. And that's all very, very tanky. One of the best health tanks in the game. Obviously, health tanking will fall off at really, really high levels, but that's why we definitely made sure to make room for at least 1 Augur mod. Luckily, this is a stat that Atlas wants to max out on already anyway. We're running every single range mod in the game to put us up to 280% range, which is great because that is increasing the range of our exploding punches and, of course, our Petrify at a very significant 40-meter range. Obviously, that is a cone, but, there's only so much we can do. Other than that, for efficiency purposes, we are on Primed Flow, which is just giving us a very, very high energy max at 755. We don't really have to worry that much about energy spend because Landslide gets cheaper as you continue to punch, so the energy cost is much lower than you might think it to be initially. Petrify also is a 75 cost ability, and you're going to cast it relatively sparingly, actually very, very little. And of course, we are on Nourish, so our energy economy is more than perfect with the addition of this ability, and adding viral damage to our punches is incredibly, incredibly good. It is worth noting, this build does not need Nourish. Nourish is here because adding viral is incredible, and it makes our energy economy absolutely perfect, giving us very little, if any, chance of ever running out of energy. There are a bunch of other options for this. If you really want your energy economy to, if you want to make room for, Blind Rage, maybe instead of Umbral Fiber, and you want to go way more strength in a direction like that, instead of Nourish, something like Lyceth's Hunt can be very good, because putting on Lyceth's Hunt plus Adiraga in order to turn on its duration boosting passive at a very easy to manage rate, that'll make it so it's an ability you cast once and then never cast again, because Adiraga should be able to prime enemies, and then you will get the orbs from them. If you do that, it's worth noting that some purple shards need to be included for Equilibrium, because those will be generating health orbs, but that's another direction you can take this build that's very good. Obviously, also, if you feel like the economy is just fine without Nourish, you can slap Roar on this, or any other, good boosts if you wanted to. You put Wrathful Advance, and there's, a few different directions to take it, but Nourish overall I find to be the strongest thing to be adding, just because it means that things will go perfectly for you. With that, the strength on this build obviously is our Umbral Intensify, which is bugged currently to not show the proper amount of strength, but if I take this out, you can see that it is dropping the proper amount whenever I do that. So this is bugged to not show its increases currently, but it is giving us 77% ability strength. In addition to that, we are on Arcane Bellicose, so with Blessing, Blessing charges up and brings us to 3,000 health, meaning that Bellicose charges up and gives us to that max of 72% additional strength bonus. So this is the best strength arcane that we can be using because it is just synergizing with how tanky we're going to be, bringing us up to like 180 something percent strength, I believe it is, which is more than we're going to need. With that, let's talk about the Landslide Fist Prime. Obviously, we're on Naramon here because we don't want to ever have to deal with combo. You could just run double Dex Arcanes. I have one Dex Arcane on the Latron currently, but Naramon is really going to make it so you're never going to have to worry about maintaining combo because it just is not going to run out because you build 20 combo on every punch. Landslide Fist Prime, though. So this is the build that I want to show off because I think this is the build that most people are probably going to want to use on Atlas. This is a raw damage build where you are just punching enemies and hitting them as hard as possible. It is worth noting, Condition Overload is in this build. This is not to be used without Diriga. So without Diriga, you are not going to be getting the Burst Lasers statuses, which is Viral, Slash, Puncture, Impact, Electricity, Radiation, and Magnetic, which is a lot of statuses to be applying to enemies. Obviously, the Diriga build here, because it's so important. Here's the full Diriga setup. And then this is the setup on Burst Laser Prime. This setup is going to, on any enemy that gets near you, just give them 7 statuses. That, with Condition Overload on your Landslide, is a absolutely tremendous amount of damage, because that is going to be in addition to the very common gas procs you're going to be getting. So, usually you're going to be getting 8 statuses with Condition Overload on hard-to-kill enemies. Although hard-to-kill is not going to be a proper description of them, whenever they have 8 statuses on them and you're punching them for like 10 million damage. That being said, this is not the only option. Obviously, there's the Influence build. Influence build is much more consistent about proccing Archon Stretch, and it is much better at general enemy clear. This build is for tougher, like specific enemies. Like if you want to punch an Acolyte once and send them to hell, this is the build that you're looking to use. If you want to punch and kill everyone you can and cannot see, that's what the Influence build is for. They have pretty different purposes. Because I've shown off a lot of the Influence builds, we are going to go with this one today. Performance-wise, there's like not actually a huge difference in like a survival, but it is just worth noting that like this will perform much better against groups. This will perform much better against one guy. That being said, we do go gas damage on this, and that is to help with our AoE, because you get like that lingering like gas clouds that enemies can wander into if they were just slightly outside of your range. That will give you some additional kills at range. So that's all well and good. For the actual output of this build, starting from absolutely nothing, we're just going to punch this group. We can turn their AI on. It's not like it's going to matter because we are invincible while we are casting our 1. And with no build-up whatsoever, we are just punching through these groups. Now, once we're at this higher combo, you're going to see just how much better this is, because you start punching for many, many more, and you also get the additional status for your Weeping in order to proc gas more often, which is going to add a lot more damage to groups. So just punching for like, 3.5 million there and so on and so forth. You can see that the energy usage here is basically nothing. Also, Nourish actually ran out there, which is a significant elemental damage boost for us. So the elemental damage boost is less important here than it would be on something like an Influence build. Basically, if the enemy doesn't have attenuation and you have energy, you can turn your energy into enemies not being what you can see on your screen, which is pretty good. That is, of course, without me ever even touching or using my 3, which is giving me not only a damage bonus, but also freezing enemies solid and turning them all into armor, which gives us up to 1,500 armor, which is a very significant bonus. But it's just a lot of damage to be outputting. And being invincible most of the time, it turns out, is pretty good. Actually, I turned on invincibility and there's really no difference in the test. Like, even if I let them shoot me, it really doesn't matter, because their AI might as well be off if you're Atlas. But yeah, it's very, very good. I will say, you do not usually really need to build up your rubble for that additional armor, and I usually am not doing it. But it is worth noting that because Umbral Fiber is not completely integral to this build, you do have room for augments if you'd like to use them. The Rumbled Augment is pretty fun, gives you some Overguard to play with by throwing on your Overguard as Rumblers whenever you cast it. I find that it's a little bit expensive, and you don't get a whole lot of Overguard, even with the high health scaling we have here, which is what Rumbled scales with. You just don't get that much overguard. You probably would want at least one additional cast shard if you were going to go into Rumbled as an option on this build. And I just don't really like it overall. I'd rather be invincible and be re-upping my shields with Augur Reach all the time and be health tanking rather than utilizing Rumble. But it's a fine augment, and it's also kind of funny whenever you throw rocks with the because it takes over your gun whenever you go into Rumbled, it does like actually build up and does influence things, which is cute, but much less damage than just pressing one. Other notes, Orgaze obviously for looting, still totally reasonable here that you're probably going to want to go more strength and actually less range if you're actually going to be like wanting to get more loot with this. Rubble Heap is a considerable damage increase, but it means that you absolutely have to always be building up rubble and recasting your 3 over and over. And generally I find that that's just absolutely not necessary and kind of lowers my KPM if I'm going into that. But making your Landslide free is more compelling on builds that are going to go for like Blind Rage and stuff and really want to pump the number as high as it can possibly go. So that's all things to consider. Path of Statues I found to be a little inconsistent. I will say if Rubble Heap and Path of Statues were one augment, I probably would make room for it because it means your one will sometimes build up that rubble kind of regardless of what you're doing. But unfortunately, that is not the case. So making room for the double augments is kind of not the greatest in the world. So for that is what we're up to. Other things that are worth noting in these slots, because if you don't have like Blessing and Bellicose, which I know are fairly new, if you do have like older things like Fury, Arcane Fury does work on this. It's 180% additional damage, which is very considerable. So you can use that to pump your numbers up as well if you don't feel like you need to go into like Blessing Bellicose or anything like that. So those are some other considerations to make for the build. But yeah, effectively we are functionally invulnerable. Even if I take this, like, you know, this, let's spawn in like the Sentient group, which is like a classically like tough group to be fighting, right? I mean, we can just pause them and just punch them, you know? Like, they don't really have much to do to stop me with this. Their like residual exploding that they can do is maybe a thing, but like realistically, there's not really anything they're going to be able to do besides spawn in a weird way, because you can see there's like the markers on the map here that are a bit odd. But yeah, there's not much that they have that they can do against this. The Murmur is much the same. I will say the Murmur are weak to electricity, so they're much weaker to the electrical builds with influence. But like they don't get a say in like whether or not this kills them. They don't have. There's like one tapping Hollow Veins. You don't want to stand in their explosions, I guess. But even if you did, just punch another guy and turn your shields back on, really. And it's great. It's absolutely excellent. Like, you know, we have 3,000 armor. We'll have 3,000 health whenever we have built up. That's a sim bug that didn't build up all the way. Yeah, we just have an immense amount of like incredible health stats, and when we punch enemies, they go to the dark zone. So yeah, that's what's going on. Let's jump into Tav and turn enemies into mush. All right, rolling into Tav. There are some things that I want to talk about. I'm probably going to make a full video on this because I've seen this sentiment in the community. And it is that everyone seems to be thinking that melee influence is, like, broken. Or, like, the only thing in the game. And I figured this video is, like, a reasonable time to talk about it. And that is that, it's not. Influence is currently the thing that's allowing a lot of melee weapons to be used whenever they otherwise would not be used. And that is a primary thing that I think is incredibly important to note. I should not have cast my Nourish first. Should have punched first to make energy out of them. There we go. Mistake on my part because I'm talking. Now we can explode, guys. Like right now, obviously on Atlas, we don't need Nourish because Atlas has some like other viable builds with like exposure, and obviously he has like inherent AoE and his exploding uppercuts and his like really cool stuff that he's doing. And that's the case for both Atlas and like Warframes like Korra and all that stuff. Like you have build options to go through, right? But oh, hello Stalker. That was very fast. You were showing up. But a thing that I think a lot of people aren't realizing is just how many melee weapons exist only as like reasonable options because influence does exist. It's not like in the absence of influence we'll use something else. There's many things that just simply would now suck without an option like influence. Oh, that's just an XMI. Hey, Stalker.
Prepare for life support.
I killed him. He's somewhere. He dropped the Scimitar Engine's blueprint. How fun. Yeah, I punched a different guy, and my exploding punches killed him. Anyway, moving on. But yeah, this is like a thing that's going around is like influence is broken, and it's like influence is very good, but we were in a meta for a long time, years actually, where Hunter Munitions was the only thing making primary weapons a thing that you'd ever use. Obviously, that recently got fixed because they reworked enemy health and armor to be like, you know, much more diverse and interesting. Right now, that's what's happening with influence. Melee influence is making a bunch of melee weapons viable, and you can kind of force it on almost anything to make it so that you can use a melee weapon that you probably would otherwise never swing. And that is not actually a bad thing, because it's making you use the weapons. It's like making it a reasonable option. Unlike what would happen if we don't have influence. If we don't have influence, some weapons would live. Specifically, slam weapons can generally go another way and not have to go influence in order to, like, you know, see enough damage. And also glaives. Glaives also are heavy attack based and AoE, and they get away without influence. Some of them do use influence, and like that is to great effect. But those weapons would survive. But like light attack builds kind of cease to exist without influence, because competing with the like primary and secondary weapons that are available for group clear just simply is not going to happen without an arcane-like influence. Now, is it good for influence in the long run to be like the only thing that we run? No. You know what else wasn't good? For arcane Deadhead and primary Deadhead and like secondary Merciless and like the Merciless and Deadhead arcanes to be like the only things we'd ever run. That obviously was not ideal. We have a bunch of primary arcanes that suck, and we were only ever using Deadhead and Merciless on pretty much every single primary. And was that an unhealthy meta? No, it's just what it was. It's like, well, you put these on the weapon and it makes the weapon more reasonable to use. It was their purpose, was to make it so that we use primary and secondary weapons more, was to give them arcanes and bring up their power level. And they did that very successfully. But only recently we got Crux. Crux, as a new arcane for primaries, made it so that there's more diverse builds. Some weapons would prefer to have Crux and actually get more damage out of Crux and can utilize like the ammo efficiency better, or really want that amount of status, and so on and so forth. And it's not that Crux is better than Merciless or Deadhead. It's just that it is another build option that is of similar power to what our better options were. And that is really important, because it's not that influence is too strong. It's that influence is strong enough. And ideally, instead of like getting rid of influence or something, we would just get other compelling options. Now, they've tried to do that, and it's been like sort of successful in parts, with arcanes like Doughty being like very interesting build-arounds that haven't really worked out all the way, I would say, as like a competitor. But like exposure is probably like the closest thing generally. And I think that, very interestingly, if they took the restriction off of Duplicate and made Duplicate work on any crit, we would be in a situation where I think that Duplicate could really stand to compete against something like Influence for different purposes. And we'd see more of that. So, like, as you can tell, I really want to talk about this. The Atlas thing, like, we kind of, hey, guess what? I'm gonna punch dudes and they gonna explode. So, like, very simple stuff occurring on screen. But I really want to talk about the like, how the melee stuff currently is in terms of balance. But, of course, if you're watching this, you know how much I want to talk about it. But, yeah. It's like just a thing that I wanted to mention, is that melee influence is not broken. It's just performing the same role as Hunter Munitions right now, as with like the old role of Hunter Munitions, which is make melee weapon usable. Hey, Malice. Goodbye, Malice. Obviously, they don't like that. And like, obviously, as you can see here, other things can work whenever things line up. Like the big AoE of Landslide and this raw damage build, it works out quite well. We're at 5 minutes, we're at 800 kills. So it's certainly not that you have to use influence, but like the melee weapon needs to be appropriate to not use influence. And in Atlas's case, Exploding Fists will do for the raw damage build. It is quite nice. But yeah, that's just kind of the point I wanted to make. Really, I really do like this like new quote-unquote Atlas build. It's kind of the same stuff that like has been good about Atlas, but now it's just much more accessible, which I enjoy. And things like, you know, Blessing and stuff like that being added in, I think, make it so that this build is much comfier. You can see we're almost at 3,000 health there, and you can see our bellicose building up. We're at 68% right now. I believe that's bellicose. Let me do a double check. Yeah, that's bellicose. So we're at 8% above what we'd be at for Molt Augmented now. And of course, just like grabbing those health orbs. It is also worth noting, like, this is a thing I actually did not mention about Lycith's Hunt. If you run Lycith's Hunt, you build up your blessing much, much faster, which is a consideration. Over like the damage gain that you get out of adding viral to your attacks. You do have the opportunity to build up your blessing much quicker, which gives you much more tankiness. As you, like, you kill, like, however many enemies, and then your blessing is maxed out pretty quickly. Yeah, 3.2 million, just, like, bumping enemies for very significant damage with Atlas. Yeah, and anyway, I just want to encourage people to, like, actually think about what does the game look like. If Influence was gone tomorrow, what does the game look like? And I think that the way that the game looks is, oh, hey, I'm going to use gun now instead of using sword. And, like, that's not a better game state than, oh, well, this melee weapon's really good, and this gun's really good, and I have to decide which one I'm swinging at any given time. And this one's Influence, which is maybe, like, a little, like, derivative. Like, Influence is a pretty common build. But, like, the fix for that is not, well, nerf Influence. Because then the common build on melee weapons will be, I don't swing this, it's just in my inventory. Which will only reinforce the, I carry the Praetos on my hip, and the Praetos makes me faster. And that, as a melee meta, is, like, horrifically awful. I'd encourage people to give a deeper thought about their melee influence bad type opinions. Because I think that it is not, like, an interesting lens to look at. Or rather, it's, like, an interesting lens to look at, but, like, if you don't think about anything other than, hey, a lot of these melee builds look the same, it can be kind of short-sighted. Because, like, you think about, like, hey, slams got changed, and now slams are used, and that's, like, a possible playstyle for melee weapons, and that's a good thing, is to have another new playstyle for weapons, right? Well, Violence, how dare you turn off my ability in mid-cast? How dare you turn off my ability in mid-cast once again? It's one of the weird things about Landslide is it can actually be canceled. There we go. Had to wait for the nullification to wear off. Luckily, I have lots of health. If like, they nerfed slams, which, by the way, for anyone who did not catch, they did on a dev short say that they're not nerfing slams. That was just a thing that, like, Pablo was musing about, which is reasonable. So we know slams aren't getting nerfed, but it was talked about very recently, so it's on people's minds. And, like, people are talking about, like, the prevalence of melee influence. If those two things were nerfed tomorrow, we'd all be wearing the Praetos on our hip and not swinging melee weapons. Or we'd be back at, like, throwing Glaive Prime, and that being, like, the only thing that's worth it to do. And I personally think that that's much more boring than I could basically make any weapon work. Like, I think that my arsenal is actually useful is much better than, well, I guess I can hold this. Because I guess I can hold this is just the stat sticks, which they just got rid of. Like, we just stopped the stat stick thing with, like, the Praetos being an option if you don't want to use melee weapons. To be like, well, you can hold this and then you're faster, and that's cool. And I think that's fine. But, yeah, I just don't want to be in a place where, like, hey, now we have to use guns and melee's not a thing. Because I think that would really suck. Anyway, I'm broken record at this point with, like, the implications of what nerfing those two things would actually look like. Turns out adding is better than subtracting whenever there's only, like, a few things propping up a particular meta to be more evenly competitive across different weapon types. And obviously, like, none of the weapon types are competing with Warframes whenever you really boil it down. Like, things like Atlas are really good now. And, like, most melee weapons aren't going to be able to compete with, like, being invincible and punching and exploding an asteroid in front of enemies. But, that's kind of the way it should be. The game's called Warframe, not do a melee weapon to it as the best thing. So yeah, that's the Atlas video. Kind of tangenty. Yeah, punch guys make explode real good. Turn enemies to stone real good. Me hit very hard, enemy die. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you tomorrow for not sure. It depends on if a hotfix comes out. Let's see what video is tomorrow. I'm not actually certain yet. Hey everybody, it's time to thank the patrons that are hanging around and supporting the channel. So, to start with that, the $10 patrons are Athean, Alex Barnum, Arbiter Daydream, Barkus, Benuven, Plotomatic, Brutus Salazar, Candelathra, Glob World, Dylan Dworsky, Athrain, James Harthorne, JC4 Science, Josh, Luzanth, Vicotel, Michta, Nerve, Ruby, Sanyu, Sharp247, The Coupon of Death, Waifu Wars, Wodad01, and Zeraphir. Also, thanks, of course, to all of the other patrons for supporting the channel. It is much appreciated. It's a little sneak peek on what we're getting into. There's going to be a lot more of these kind of big re-reviews of weapon types and their new builds and stuff as things changed a lot at the end of last year. And of course, there's also planned new free-to-play before we get into any more big updates. So look forward to that.